Hey y'all, welcome to the Southern Appalachian Herbal Podcast. I'm Judson Carroll and I'm an herbalist. I'm also a wild crafter, a gardener, and herb grower. I'm coming to you from high atop the beautiful Blue Ridge Mountains of North Carolina, just a stone's throw from the Tennessee line, overlooking the Pisgah National Forest. Absolutely surrounded by the bounty of God's green earth. I spent most of my life wandering these mountains and learning about plants from the old-timers and all sorts of characters. On this show, we'll talk about herbs and how to use them, how to find them, how to grow them, how to make preparations. We'll talk about a lot of things. We can also talk about permaculture, homesteading, foraging, and living off the land. Most anything, really. You can email me at southernappalachianherbs@gmail.com if you have a question or a comment. You can also contact me through the Grow Network, where I'm a regular contributor and a moderator for the forums. And my blog is, of course, southernappalachianherbs@blogspot.com. All right, y'all. I'm going to sit my guitar down and let's talk about herbs.
Hey y'all, welcome to this week's show. I hope everyone had an absolutely wonderful Easter and you're enjoying this beautiful spring weather. I know I had a nice one. Getting a little late start to the week because of the holiday, but we'll jump right in here. Today we're going to talk about probably two spring foraging plants from my book, The Spring Foraging Cookbook, and probably two medicinal herbs from my book, Medicinal Weeds and Grasses. So let's start with the edibles, because it's always fun to talk edibles, and they're pretty brief. The first is River Beauty. Now, River Beauty is an epilobium like fireweed. Now, as I've mentioned before, there are several plants called fireweed, but the epilobium is the probably the most common one. That's the one, if you look up online, just the common name fireweed, you're going to start seeing pictures of it. But according to many, River Beauty is a bit nicer as a wild vegetable. The tender spring shoots make an asparagus-like vegetable, and the leaves are used as a pot herb. When very tender, it could probably be added to salads, but I've never tried it. Snacking on it in the woods is pleasant. It's a nice, just little something you can pick as you're walking through the woods. River Beauty would be a great option to include in a mix of spring veggies and greens. To my taste, it probably isn't one I'd want to eat in large quantities by itself, but I rarely find large quantities where I live. Apparently, it grows more abundantly in some areas than others, and when it does, folks seem to acquire quite a taste for it. It's one of those really sought-after spring herbs. And it may be that I've been harvesting a little too late in the season, because as the plant matures, it becomes increasingly bitter. So it just may be that I'm going to have to make an effort this year to scout out patches of River Beauty and mark them in my notebook and come to them a little bit earlier in the year and see what I can find next spring. And I would probably suggest you do the same. Go ahead, if you can find some, try it and see if you like it. And if it's a little too tough, a little too bitter, just make note of where you found it and come back the next spring. It really should be harvested during the bud stage before the flowers open, and I don't really think I've ever found it before the flowers have begun to open. So the other one is far more common, rushes. I find rushes just about everywhere I find water. I harvest them for basketry and stuff. It's actually a good food. And as far as I know, at least the American varieties, versions of rushes can be used interchangeably for food. The one I harvest most is known as bulrush. You may remember the bulrushes from the Bible, or the basket that Moses was put in, right? Rushes grow, just about every creek, every pond, every body of water I can think of. In just about every region, you're going to find rushes and cattails, and both are really important food plants. There's also one known as, I guess it's Tule, T-U-L-E, or Tule. That has more edible uses documented than bulrush, but bulrush is more common where I live. And like I said, They're all great for weaving baskets. They're great for making seats for chairs, wooden chairs that have the rush seats that often break down over time. You can make cordage out of rush, real easy. It's one of those just super important survival plants, and both species, the bulrush and the tule, can make really good flour. The roots are an important flour plant. As I've mentioned before, we talked about kudzu and a few others. Starchy root foods are a premium value for wild foods. This one's really relatively easy, and I think along with fall acorns, the rushes are one I would absolutely prioritize if I were relying solely on wild food for survival. And you can make a flour out of cattail pollen. There's so many things you can make a flour out of, and any of those would be really good together. And a survival situation. I mean, they'd be a lifesaver. But I'm just going to say I'm glad that I don't have to rely solely on wild foods. I mean, I love to forage and I love to fish and hunt and all that. But it's also nice to have a garden. And if you can keep some small livestock, and I mean, never forget, a grocery store is a great luxury our ancestors didn't have. And I don't like to rely too heavily on just one source of anything. It's a permaculture principle to have at least 3 ways to accomplish every goal. So like on my property, I have 4 sources for water, only one of which relies on electricity. Well, I look at it the same way between foraging, fishing and hunting, a garden, livestock, a grocery store, networking with other small farmers and such. I have various ways to put food on the table. That gives me more food security, so storing food and all that. And the stable food sources also allow me to cook wild foods in season in a way that'd be very difficult otherwise. If the only cooking oil I had was rendered bear fat, for instance, I would not be doing a lot of deep frying. Cooking fat would be absolutely precious because you can't obtain cooking fat from wild plant sources. I mean, yeah, there's some seeds that you could press for oil, but you'd have to have a press. And a lot of game is quite lean. I mean, rabbits have basically no fat at all. Squirrels have a little, not enough to really render. I mean, you'd really actually be looking for raccoons and bears and such. A lot of people turn their noses up at. Deer is what I meant to say. Deer, quite lean, very, extremely lean. At least most times of the year, So, it really is a great luxury and very important to have that food security of having different sources of food. I don't want anybody to get the idea of like foraging as a panacea solution for all your food needs. No, you're going to have other ways of putting food on the table, even if it's just a little garden or a local grocery store. And that makes the forage foods really become a delicacy, as opposed to a necessity. So to obtain flour made from the roots of rushes, harvest at least a couple pounds, trim and scrub them, wash them really well, peel and cut them up as finely as possible, and boil them down to a sort of cooked oatmeal-like consistency. Thoroughly dry and use just as you would wheat flour. But it's better to mix both rushes and acorn meal. I think it's a much better taste and a better texture, and you get extra nutrition, and you get some fats from the acorns, and it's good. Wheat flour especially has been bred for its gluten content. You're not going to have gluten in rush flour or acorn flour. It's more like cornmeal, if you want to think of it that way. Gluten's a protein in wheat that forms almost like elastic bands, like rubber bands, and it traps the bubbles of the yeast and allows the bread to rise. As the yeast begins to eat those starches, it produces carbon dioxide. Gluten allows the bread to rise. You're not going to get a good rise. Now, you can absolutely add baking powder or baking soda, just as you would with cornmeal, and you can make a rush flour bread that way, or you could just make a flat bread. This would be more for making like pitas or tortillas, or Yeah, even pancakes to an extent. I mean, yeah, and if you added um, some baking powder, baking soda, whatever, you're going to make some nice pancakes out of that, especially if you've got some nut meal in there as well. Okay, and with the bulrush or tule, you can also harvest the tender shoots and the cores of the stems. I think the tule is preferred for that, as well as the pollen. Just think of this rush just as you would cattails. The roots can be peeled and eaten as you would potatoes or Jerusalem artichokes. The roots contain sugar, so they're an important source of nutritional energy. Shoots and stem cores can be cooked just as you would any green vegetable. Use the steam saute method, just as you would with asparagus, or slice them thin and eat them raw. The roots are good, very good actually, added to roasts and stews. And I think they're best sliced and cooked with some fat and onions, like I would potatoes. Rushes grow by water, so frying up the roots like potatoes to serve with fish is a natural combination. The pollen is not well, it's not terribly useful on its own, but it is nutritious. If possible, combine it with pine pollen. They're going to be pollinating at about the same time, and or cattail pollen, and add it in with your flour or meal that we made from the roots, or from, if it's just regular flour or whatever you got, buckwheat flour, whatever. That's really good. It's going to add a lot of nutrition to your bread. In terms of nutritional energy, edible pollens are really superfood. And the same is true of chia seeds. One way I like using such food is not usually in bread, but if I don't want to make a bread, I make pemmican. Pine pollen is also very supportive of testosterone in men. Combined with calorie-dense fats and protein and vitamins, it's sort of like an ancient energy bar. And it will definitely help whenever hard work and endurance is required. Pemmican can be made with any combination of animal fat, dried fruit, berries, nuts, seeds, and dried meat. Dried meat's sort of like jerky or biltong, or even dried smoked salmon. You can absolutely make a pemmican with dried smoked salmon, and the meat's optional. I mean, you can actually leave it out, but you do need the fat, so it's not a vegan dish. Grind everything up finely and just make it into bars. Allow them to dry. Pemmican was to the Native American what fruitcake was to medieval Europeans. It's stored food energy. When my ancestors went on the Crusades, like King Richard Lionheart, who's actually an ancestor of mine, went on crusades, they carried fruitcakes. Dense, heavy, a lot of dried fruit and nuts soaked down in brandy to preserve it. And that was, the ancient energy bar of Europe. And I still think a real fruitcake, like the actual thing, not the neon colored bright fruit stuff you get from the store that's really pretty nasty. A real fruitcake, made with dried fruit and nuts and soaked down in brandy or sherry is really, truly one of my favorite things. A lot of honey in there, and so nutritiously dense. That, of course, can be vegan, even though the traditional fruitcakes would have used beef fat or lard or goose fat. You don't have to. It's going to be much healthier for you if you do. In fact, the goose fat is the healthiest fat on earth, and grass-fed beef comes in like just behind that. But pemmican also, because it has the dried meat mixed in, which may sound a little weird, but if you've ever had a mince pie, yes, my British ancestors used to put meat and suet and fruit together all the time. I mean, that's a real traditional thing in many cultures, many cultures. The ancient Greeks did that. The Egyptians did that. I mean, you can go back. The Babylonians were big on mixing fruit and honey with meats. It's a little odd to our palate, but if you've had sweet relish on a hot dog, you kind of get the idea. It's not bad at all. Or like Chinese food where you get a little sugar in the sauce, like sweet and sour sauce. You get used to it real easy, and pemmican is so nice. And okay, so I told you kind of how to just grind it together, and the pollen and the seeds will help it firm up quickly. So the pollen is really an asset in there. And, not only is it tasty, stuff lasts forever. And, you really feel like an old-fashioned woodsman who lived by a knife and a gun and an axe. It may not put hair on your chest, but the nutritional content could actually make your hair and beard grow thicker. So, really good stuff. And actually, the pine pollen, with its boost for testosterone, could thicken that beard as well. So, let's get into the herbs. And the herbs for this week We're going to start with an interesting one. It's Hydrocodal umbellata. It's known as dollarweed or marsh pennywort. Some people call it mini flower or money plant, navelwort, which is a very odd name, and pennywort. This is one of those weeds that seems to be a native of Japan. I don't know how we got all kinds of Japanese so-called weeds here in the American South, probably around 1900, but you would be amazed how many of the so-called invasive weeds that are, medicinal, edible, and often very pretty originate in Japan. Of course, kudzu springs to mind, but Japanese honeysuckle, and I could go through so many. We must have had a lot of trade with Japan in the late 1800s, early 1900s. That's all I can figure. And whether these hitchhiked along or they were brought here intentionally, I have no idea. But, rather than eradicate them, learn to use them. And there's not a lot of information documented in Western herbal medicine on pennywort or hydrocodal umbellata, dollarweed, whatever you want to call it. But Resources of Southern Fields and Forests tells us that it was used in the 1860s, so it got here prior to 1860, before the Civil War. It was common in bogs and wet marshes around Charleston, New Bern, North Carolina, Florida, throughout the South. It had already become very widespread. It was being used in Brazil as a medication against a condition called hypochondriacism. And that's an old, almost impossible to pronounce word for hypochondria. Well, now we think of hypochondria as people who complain a lot about medical conditions that may be, entirely in their heads, right? Entirely emotional. Becomes sort of an insult. It can actually be a swelling of the it can actually be a swelling of the actual hypochondria, that is a tissue in the abdomen and chest. And they said that according to one author, the root is valuable in diseases of the kidneys and far exceeds other medicines. It was emetic, diuretic, and vulnerary. So I'm thinking in that case of hypochondria, they were actually talking the medical condition, and the diuretic property of this herb was reducing that inflammation swelling. Vulnerary means wound healing, emetic means it helps you throw up. So that's really the only aspect of this plant that I would see. And it says the author at this time, who was a French botanist in the 1860s, says, I see no mention of it in the English or American works. Well, if it's actually native to Japan, it probably got rooted in South America before coming to North America, before it ever got to Europe, if it's even there. But by 1898, it was being used in the American Pharmacopoeia. And King's Medical Dispensatory tells us that the plant should be ranked among the acronarcotic poisons. So it actually has a somewhat toxicity to it. I want to make that clear. As they say, however, others have found it useful as a remedy against elephantiasis, which they describe as a form of leprosy. And they list a lot of different researchers and doctors have derived benefit from it in chronic eczema and other cutaneous maladies, so good for skin issues. Remember they said in the other entry it was vulnerary wound healing, so it's probably soothing to the skin when used as used topically. Used in scrofula, syphilis, ulcers, chronic rheumatism, and that again could be more the diuretic properties used internally. It is an active agent, large amounts inducing headache, dizziness, and stupor, as well as bloody passage from the bowels. So it's not one you want to play around with. Itching of the skin is said to be occasioned by it, so it can cause some dermatitis. And by 1898, they said, notwithstanding the favorable reports concerning the efficacy of this plant, it has fallen into disuse and is seldom employed in the present day. Well, if it is, that toxic, it's probably a reason. However, Plants for a Future, which is written in the last 20 years or so, Says medicinal use of water pennywort, depurative, febrifuge, resolves mucus formation. The juice of the plant is used in the treatment of fevers. A paste from the plant is applied externally to wounds and to boils. The plant is decocted and used in the treatment of abscesses, boils, bruises, cirrhosis, colds, coughs, hepatitis, hepatoma, influenza, itch, jaundice, sinusitis, and sore throat, and is a Chinese herbal drug for hepatoma. Well, that's very interesting because Plants for the Future doesn't give us any warnings. I think we're going to have to do some more research into this plant. If you have some growing, it would be well worth looking into the Asian use of the plant. But it appears that its toxicity is really only an issue in larger doses. So it's not one I have had a chance to play with yet. But when I do, I'll let you know. And one that's far more common, even though it has one of its common names is Japanese bloodgrass, it doesn't come from Japan at all. In fact, it comes from Europe. We know it usually as Cogon grass, and the Latin name is Imperator cylindrica. And little documentation. You'll find this with a lot of the grasses, but Plants for Future says the flowers and root are antibacterial, diuretic, febrifuge, ciliagog, styptic, and tonic. So this is a very useful plant, okay? Often just considered a weedy grass, but antibacterial, diuretic with, not causing, without all the side effects of the aforementioned plant. Febrifuge means it can help lower a fever. Styptic means it can help stop bleeding. I mean, any of these actions would make this one really worth looking into. The flowers are used in the treatment of hemorrhages and wounds. So the flowers actually have a styptic quality. They are decocted, that means made into essentially a tea, and used to treat urinary tract infections, fevers, thirst, etc. The root is astringent, antifebrile, diuretic, emollient, hemostatic, restorative, and tonic. That's very interesting. I mean, this is one that can actually help kind of bring you back to health and stimulate the appetite. It is used in the treatment of nosebleeds, hematuria, edema, and jaundice. The root has an antibacterial action against Staphylococcus. Now, this is very important. Staphylococcus can be very, very serious. It can be deadly. And so whenever we have an herb that has antibacterial action against one of the big ones, like Staphylococcus, it says it's also effective against Bacillus dysentery, etc. I mean, that's the one that causes dysentery. We need to identify these plants and learn to use them because, bacteria can become antibiotic resistant. So whenever we have herbs that have antibacterial actions, adding them to our natural medicine cabinet is good for everybody's health, actually. A decoction of the root is used as anthelmintic. That means it can help get rid of worms, intestinal parasites, and also treat digestive disorders such as digestion, diarrhea, and dysentery. The root bark is febrifuge, restorative, and tonic that helps lower fevers, and we just did restorative and tonic. Extracts of the plant have been shown virucidal and anti-cancer activity. Virucidal, that means the extract of the plant may be antiviral and has anti-cancer activity. So this was the one I really wanted to focus on today, even though it's a short entry. I think a lot of research should be done into Cogon grass. That's Imperator cylindrica. This plant right here has so many uses that rather than spray Roundup on it and treat it as a weed, we really need to be utilizing this plant. And hopefully there are, some clinical and pharmaceutical type researchers that will really look into the uses of this plant. I mean, if it's antibiotic against, or I should say antibacterial against Staphylococcus, and the one that causes dysentery, that's Bacillus dysenteriae, etc. They don't even give a full listing. Antiviral and anti-cancer, and can also stop bleeding. That's pretty big. That's pretty good. So y'all, Grasses can be a bit difficult to identify. There are some very good field guides to grasses, sedges, and rushes. And today we covered rushes and we covered a grass. Start with Botany in a Day, Thomas Elpel. He'll teach you how to identify those three distinctly different grasses, sedges, and rushes that can often look alike. You always remember the saying, sedges have edges. That's the first thing you learn about these. Get that. Get a good plant app on your phone. iNaturalist, I think, is the one I've been using, and learn to identify those grasses certainly before you have some landscaper come. Just tear up all the weedy grasses in your yard and put in turf. Not only is that going to cost you a fortune in the long run with all the fertilizer and irrigation and weed killer you're going to have to put on it, but you may have some really valuable plants in your yard right now, and you just have to learn to use them. That's it, and that's what I'm hoping to teach y'all to do. So, have a great week. I hope you get to enjoy this spring weather, do a little foraging, do a little wild crafting. Just get out there and soak in some vitamin D in the sunshine, if nothing else. And I will talk to y'all next week.
The information in this podcast is not intended to diagnose or treat any disease or condition. Nothing I say or write has been evaluated or approved by the FDA. I'm not a doctor. The U.S. government does not recognize the practice of herbal medicine, and there is no governing body regulating herbalists. Therefore, I'm really just a guy who studies herbs. I'm not offering any advice. I won't even claim that anything I write or say is accurate or true. I can tell you what herbs have been traditionally used for. I can tell you my own experience and if I believe an herb has helped me. I cannot nor would I tell you to do the same. If you use an herb anyone recommends, you are treating yourself. You take full responsibility for your health. Humans are individuals and no two are identical. What works for me may not work for you. You may have an allergy, a sensitivity, an underlying condition that no one else even shares and you don't even know about. Be careful with your health. By continuing to listen to my podcast or read my blog, you agree to be responsible for yourself, do your own research, make your own choices, and not to blame me for anything ever.